I'm happy to introduce my dear friend, Professor Stephen Berg, who will lecture tonight on Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Mr. Berg received his PhD in philosophy at the Catholic University of America, studying with, among others, Richard Kennington, who for a number of us was one of the most important students and scholars of modern philosophy. Before that, Mr. Berg received one of his master's degrees from St. John's College here in Santa Fe, and he remains to this day a friend of the college and a fierce advocate of our program. He sees us as one of the places in the world that a genuine liberal arts education is possible. Mr. Berg published a superb book on Plato's Symposium and is presently working on a book on Dante's Divine Comedy. He is also published in such journals as Interpretation and Ancient Philosophy, as well in collections of essays and fest scripts. Tonight we will begin our question period just a few minutes after the end of the lecture, just enough time for those of you who wish to remain to sort of move up a few rows and enjoy in what I anticipate will be a lively discussion. Please welcome Stephen Berg.
Well, thank you. It's very nice to be back at St. John's College, as always. And I won't try your patience more than necessary, so I'll just get down to business and start with the lecture. Can everyone hear me properly? Pretty well? Good. Okay. Well, Nietzsche, as he himself tells us, is an author who does everything he can to be hard to understand. He chose to adopt a manner of writing, his aphoristic style, which makes it impossible for his reader, absent a prodigious effort of thought on his own part, to follow the arguments of his books. As a consequence, the interpretation of the meaning of those arguments has been a matter of dispute since Nietzsche's works first gained the attention of scholars and the reading public. There is certainly dispute about how to interpret his most famous work, Thus Spoke Zarathus-tra, the one writing in which he does not employ his aphoristic style. Should one assume that Nietzsche puts forward the titular protagonist of his work as a kind of megaphone through which to disseminate doctrines of his own? The title of the work itself pleads caution in this regard. This book presents us with the speeches not of Friedrich Nietzsche, but of a character of his invention. An author of Nietzsche's stature adopts a dramatic form, a book in which speeches are attributed to a cast of characters and offered within an unfolding plot, not in order to indulge in catechism, but rather to make questionable the nature of his thought. Accordingly, we must always keep in mind that Zarathustra is not Nietzsche, unless we be tempted, nonetheless, to conflate the two. A few elementary reflections will make clear to us just how far apart the author and his character stand. From the publication of Human All Too Human, Nietzsche is eager to identify himself as a philosopher, and he makes the character of philosophy and the life of philosophy one of his most prominent themes and questions. Within the pages of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, by contrast, the word philosophy simply does not appear. Consequently, Zarathustra certainly never identifies himself as a philosopher, nor should we. In his very first soliloquy, he declares, "Behold, I am weary of my wisdom. Like a bee that has gathered too much honey, I need hands that reach out. I want to bestow and distribute." Zarathustra, in his own estimation, is a wise man who wishes to disburden himself of that wisdom's superfluity through its transmission. By means of that transmission, he will become man again. Zarathustra is, according to his self-conception, not only overflowing with the riches of his wisdom, he is more than a mere man. Nietzsche, even as most boastful, never claims to be more than a human being, if a somewhat exceptional one. And he insists that even to style oneself a lover of wisdom is a little too close to indulging in unseemly vanity. By this measure, Zarathustra's vanity is boundless. If his claim to wisdom is mere vanity, Then Zarathustra's wisdom is pseudo-wisdom, and his self-understanding radically incomplete. The incomplete character of Zarathustra's self-understanding is among the central themes of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The most obvious sign of Zarathustra's lack of self-understanding is his failure. He fails in the chief task he sets for himself in his first speech in the book, the distribution of his wisdom. Zarathustra fails not once, but, taking into account part 4, 3 times in the distribution of his wisdom. Whatever aim Zarathustra seeks to accomplish through this distribution, this aim remains unfulfilled. His failures compel Zarathustra to realize the false character of this wisdom, to move from pseudo-wisdom to genuine understanding, from a false solution to the true problems, from opinion to knowledge, is to move from thoughtlessness to thought, from the sleep of the mind to wakefulness itself. It is the true conversion, transformation, or metamorphosis of the mind. This transformation of the mind proves to be the pivot around which the argument of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra revolves. At the opening of the first part of the book, following upon his failure with his teaching of the overman to excite the souls of the multitude in the marketplace to anything but ridicule and laughter, Zarathustra offers his first speech to his potential disciples. Its title is On the Three Transformations. In this speech, Zarathustra gives us his account of the coming to be of the mind. He describes how what he takes to be mind in its true form arises from out of prior states that are not yet mind, properly speaking. Zarathustra, according to his common practice, offers images of these 3 forms of the mind: the camel, the lion, and the child. For Zarathustra to consider himself capable of tracing these transformations, he must believe himself to have achieved them, to arrive at the final state of the mind, the child. Zarathustra puts forward this series of conversions as the path to the wisdom that, at the outset of the book, he understands himself to possess. In the transmission of this wisdom, he will guide the souls of his disciples along the same path. In his account of the metamorphosis of the mind, Zarathustra assumes the identity of the mind and the will. Accordingly, he describes the mind in its beginning as reverent, law-abiding, as ascending from there to mind as willfully antinomian, and as finding its completion in a mind that is said to be identical to the will that wills its own will. That is, will as a first cause in the superlative sense. On what grounds does Zarathustra make plausible this conflation of mind and will? Because of the dogmatic mode in which Zarathustra presents his teaching to his disciples, this is a question that is rather difficult to answer. A dogmatic order in the presentation of a teaching obscures the order of its discovery and thereby its true foundations. Zarathustra does finally make clear, however, that he has arrived at his current understanding by having made a return to the beginnings of the tradition of the West. Many lands Zarathustra saw and many peoples. Thus he discovered many people's good and evil. This is an unmistakable echo of the opening of Homer's Odyssey, wherein Odysseus is described in similar terms. Many were the men whose cities he saw and learned their minds. Yet if Homer, in the figure of Odysseus, gives us the first representation of the philosopher who, on the basis of his discovery of the distinction between law and nature, initiates an ascent beyond the putative wisdom of the city and its laws, Zarathustra understands himself to have found the truth of all things in what he takes to be the animating spirit of the city and its law. No greater power on earth did Zarathustra find than good and evil. The power sought, not the truth claimed, by the city is the key, according to Zarathustra, to interpreting the meaning of the variety of tables of good and evil that various peoples hang up over themselves. It is the table of their self-overcomings, the voice of their will to power. Though Zarathustra begins his search for wisdom, as had Odysseus, with a variety of peoples and their laws, He interprets the significance of this variety of laws in terms that are alien to the self-understanding of these peoples. The laws are said by the people they govern and form to be not only holy, but simply true. To assess the laws in the light of their truth or falsehood is to assess them according to their proper measure, in speech. Zarathustra, however, examines these laws in terms of what he takes to be their effectual truth. Considered in this light, they may be held to be the condition of a people's deeds, its victory and dominion over its neighbor. Whatever the differences distinguishing one people's law from another, according to the measure of the truth, they are all one and the same, according to Zarathustra, in giving expression to and acting as conditions for the will to power of a political community. It is in light of this understanding of the primary function of law is above all else an act of war, whereby a people distinguishes itself from its neighbor in its opinions in order to vanquish this same people as an enemy indeed, that Zarathustra attributes to law its primary function. No people could live, he says, if it did not first esteem. Esteeming, the creation of a table of good and evil, is the condition of the preservation and enhancement of the life of a people. And this creation is an act and expression of its will to power. Accordingly, Zarathustra concludes that the will to power is, in the first instance, the ground of the collective life of a people. Zarathustra wholly rejects the common Enlightenment teaching regarding the priority of the sly, self-interested individual. The political community is not the result of some contract among formerly independent persons. On the contrary, the individual arises from out of the collectivity of the people, and the individual emerges late. The individual himself is still the youngest creation, Zarathustra declares. How precisely does Zarathustra conceive this youngest creation to have arisen from the creation of values as directed to the advancement of the life and power of a people? Zarathustra's account of the coming to be of the individual is identical to his account of the transformations of the mind. The coming to be of mind in the proper sense of probity, the youngest of the virtues, as he says, is coextensive with the coming to be of the individual. Since the collective life of a people under law is prior to the life of the individual and mind, strictly speaking, and since that collective life is animated by the spirit of their will to power, Zarathustra must offer an account of the coming to be of the individual mind from out of the soil of the will to power and its formation of and by law. He must, in terms of the images of Zarathustra's first speech, to which we have referred already, explain how the lion emerges from the camel and the child from the lion. We recall the camel is mind and will subordinate to law and tradition, to the table of values that has established a people and permitted it to live and conquer. The camel is law-abiding will and mind. By contrast, the lion is mind as lawless in the sense not of transcending law, but being at war with law. It is antinomian mind, determined negatively by this opposition. Finally, the child proves to be mind as law-giving, legislating, the creative will, as Zarathustra says. Zarathustra faces a great challenge in showing just how the lion, mind contra law, infused with the spirit of the will's self-assertion, arises from the experience of the camel, distinguished as it is by a deep, self-abnegating reverence of mind and will for the law. Though initially Zarathustra remained silent concerning the relation between the table of good and evil, the values or the law of a people, and the god or gods of a people, he makes up for this silence in part two. Originally, he had declared that whatever empowers a people such that it rules and is victorious and shines to the dread and envy of its neighbor, that it considers as the high, the first, the measure, the meaning of all things. At the same time, he had taught that that which a people considers to be most needful, freeing, rarest, and heaviest it praises as holy. On the famous wise man, he adds that behind the first, the most needful, and the heaviest stands the God of the people and its victories, the Lord of armies, the putative cause of the conquering power of a people. The people kneels before this burden and offers up its obedience to it. It thereby worships its own will to power, divinized and personified. The camel reflects this reverent spirit. It bears all paternal burdens. It finds in duty its fulfillment and in piety its highest virtue. And yet, in his description of the camel on the three Metamorphoses, Zarathustra had already introduced elements anticipating the character of the lion. This can be seen above all in the camel's devotion to the truth. The will to truth of antinomian mind, Zarathustra claims, is nascent in law-abiding mind, in reverent mind. The camel, for the sake of truth, will suffer hunger in its soul. It will retreat into the same desert wherein the lion rules and wages war against all law. Indeed, that desert is of the camel's own creation. But how can this be so? As we have seen, according to Zarathustra's account, God is the voice of the will to power of a people. Thus, the power of a victorious people's God is thought to display the impotence of its neighbors' gods, their impotence, their falsehood, and their falsehood, their nothingness. The all-conquering God is the one true God, the solitary divinity whose power is convertible with his being, and that being with the truth. In the God of gods, the truth is made holy and divine. To this holy of holies, all else is to be sacrificed, all else subordinated. In its service, any pain or misery must be endured, even life itself sacrificed, if death is the path to victory assured. Thus, the personification and divinization of the will to power ultimately gives rise to the supremacy of the will to truth. From out of the good conscience of the camel arises the intellectual conscience of the lion. The lion may reign in the desert, but his realm is consequent upon the camel's elevation of knowledge of the truth to the one thing needful. Once regnant, triumphing under the sign of the supremacy of truth, the lion declares a sacred no to duty. In every thou shalt it once took as its cherished burden, it finds delusion and despotism. Fully formed, the lion turns upon the God of truth himself, eager to sacrifice this last delusion on the very altar upon which it was once revered. The lion rejoices in the aridity of the wasteland it has formed. It takes joy in this severity against itself. Cruelty is at the heart of its virtue, probity. According to Zarathustra, all probity is but an intellectualization of such cruelty of the will. Such virtuous cruelty is instantiated in the lion as conscience of the mind, a form of mind that Zarathustra describes as life that itself cuts into life. Thus, from out of the will to power and its creation of values, as the conditions of the collective life of a people, is born, as an unintended consequence of such legislation or evaluation, a will to truth, contemptuous and destructive of the claims of the values supporting collective life, contemptuous of the so-called virtues of the herd. Though the creative will and the values it legislates in the service of collective life, on the one hand, and the will to truth and the individual in possession of probity standing apart from the herd, on the other, have both arisen, according to Zarathustra, as emanations of the will to power. The creative will and the will to truth have now fallen into an antagonistic opposition. The will as obedient to law, in service of life, collides with will as a drive to knowledge and truth. Life and wisdom are at odds. Or so it would appear. In fact, however, the lion's devotion to the supremacy of the truth is yet adopted as a sacred duty, It is a devotion to truth as the highest moral value. The lion, despite or because of his intellectual conscience, accepts on the basis of faith alone, as a matter of mere belief, the supreme value of the truth. Accordingly, Zarathustra conceives the child as the resolution of this seeming conflict between the will to truth and the esteeming will. He projects the final form of mind as one in which the devotion to truth and the laying down of law are fully and seamlessly conjoined. This conjunction he foresees in an act of legislation undertaken in full awareness of the truth of all legislation. The creation of a universal table of values on the basis of final wisdom regarding the true source and proper end of all creation of values. In the form of the child, Zarathustra looks forward to his own creation of a new table of values for mankind as a whole, a creation that centers around, as its highest value, the creation of value itself. To understand better just what this might entail, we must attend to some of the details of the teaching that Zarathustra offers to his disciples in the hope of encouraging their metamorphosis of the mind. Within that teaching, Zarathustra's conflation of the will and the mind finds its complement in his reduction of the body to the soul. The soul is a word for something about the body, he said. He employs, however, the phenomenon he believes he has discovered in his examination of the political life of peoples as an explanatory causal principle when it comes to body. The body is a shepherd and a herd, he says. The herd is the variety of the passions. The shepherd, the will to power. The will to power is the root cause of all the passions and the truth of what is called body. The division of will to power into the evaluating will and the will to truth, however, has robbed the body of its coherence, its unity, and so its health. The body has despaired of the body, as Zarathustra says. Zarathustra's teaching regarding the child entails the reunification of the creative or legislating will and the will to truth through the creation of a comprehensive table of values, a rational law that takes as its highest value, once again, the source of the creation of values, the will to power itself, and as its supreme virtue, the bestowing virtue, one in which power and knowledge are combined. This bestowing virtue, the creative will, willing itself in its truth as the highest good, is meant to introduce a genuine unity into the individual human being for the first time. No longer will passion battle passion, or virtue contend against virtue. The herd will hearken to the voice of its shepherd when all the virtues, all the transfigured passions, submit to the supreme virtue, the transfigured will to power, at one with the will to truth, the bestowing virtue. Thus, the human being who represents the practice of the bestowing virtue in its most comprehensive form is the true individual in the strict sense. He is the child. Since for as long as God stood on the horizon as the highest value, that is, as long as mankind has existed, man has been defined by the will divided against itself. This projected unity of the will must be a transhuman state. This true individual is the overman, as he calls him. Zarathustra identifies himself with the truth of the embodied overman. Yet this identification can only be provisional. Zarathustra has descended to mankind. He has become a teacher of disciples, not primarily, as is generally assumed, from altruistic, salvific, or humanitarian motives. He is certainly not in the business of providing charity to the rabble, as he calls them, who inspire in him only the most violent loathing and nausea. His concern is rather with letting the overman live, namely with himself and his wisdom. His wisdom, as we have begun to detect, in taking as its premise the unity of the mind and the will, requires that knowledge be confirmed in action. If knowledge and power are to meet in one, then only a truth effective in action can be understood to be knowledge of something actually known. If Zarathustra's transhuman state is to be confirmed, then it must somehow be made a consequence of the action of his will. Zarathustra envisions this confirmation taking the form of creating another like himself. If Zarathustra's freedom of mind and will can become the cause of the liberation of the minds and wills of his disciples, then that freedom will be verified. Zarathustra can pretend to cause this liberation, of course, only by means of speech, both persuasive and truthful. Neither the free mind nor the free will can owe its freedom to fraud or force. This is why, though Zarathustra's ambitions prove to have a very far-reaching political character, he conceives of the ultimate accomplishments of his aims in terms of the erection of a best regime that embraces all mankind and brings into being, as he calls it, humanity itself for the first time with the advent of the great noon. He eschews all sources of action but those of reasoning and rhetoric. Consequently, if there is something that necessarily stands in the way of Zarathustra's effecting this metamorphosis of his disciples through speech alone, Zarathustra will face a true difficulty. If such an obstacle were to prove refractory, this teaching would be refuted. It is no accident that the two speeches to which to which Nietzsche draws our attention when offering his reflections on Thus Spoke Zarathus-tra in Ecce Homo are the night song and the dance song. The former represents the moment in the drama when Zarathustra first becomes aware of the insoluble contradiction at the heart of his attempt to create fellow creators, while the latter, the dance song, portrays Zarathustra for the first time, though hardly the last, reflecting on the significance of this perplexity, that is, on the problems that must be faced in the wake of the failure of his teaching. Several times during the course of Part 1, Nietzsche had inserted into the unfolding action of the plot hints and clues as to the difficulties confronting Zarathustra's teaching and his attempt to transmit it. These difficulties were made visible above all in On the Tree on the Mountainside, On Little Women, Young and Old, and On the Adder's Bite. Each of these speeches introduced dialogue into the otherwise featureless terrain of Zarathustra's undisturbed monologue. The last was concerned above all with the question of justice and the desire for revenge. At the close of this speech, having been bitten by the venomous adder, Zarathustra made the following remarkable statement. For the person who would be just from the ground up, even lies become acts of friendship to men. But how could I want to be just from the ground up? How can I give to each his own? Let this suffice for me. I give to each my own. Zarathustra admits that the frankness of speech he believes required for the success of his project must fall short of what he knows to be the truth of perfect justice, which would require at very least the introduction of irony into his speeches. He cannot give to each what is his own in giving to them what he believes to be his possession, the truth. During the course of Part 2, while battling his enemies in an attempt to distinguish in his disciples' eyes their false teaching from his own, Zarathustra confronts the problems of justice and revenge once more. And once more he is bitten by a venomous representative of the preachers of justice as equality. A poisonous tarantula this time. And this time he appears to succumb to the poison of this tribune and tyrant of the rabble whom he so despises. Divinely certain and beautiful, it bites his finger and declares, punishment and justice must be. And it mocks Zarathustra for having sung songs of enmity in the ruins of the ancient Christian temple where the tarantula makes his home. Certain and beautiful, let us also be enemies, my friends, Divinely, let us struggle against one another, Zarathustra had importuned his own disciples, no doubt much to their confusion. The bite and venom of the tarantula strikes home. Zarathustra knows that this time the problem of justice and of equality and inequality demands, or what it demands, will also make his soul turn with revenge. What is the meaning of this confrontation and confession? This is made clear in the Night Song, which soon follows. The Night Song is the first of 3 songs that interrupt Zarathustra's renewed presentation of his teaching in part 2. Each of these speeches takes love as its central theme. The Night Song is the first real soliloquy of the book. More precisely, it is a colloquy of Zarathustra with his own soul. No longer can he ignore the soul as merely a word for something about the body. The Night Song is Zarathustra's meditation on and image of the fulfillment of his attempt to transform the minds of his disciples. The speech has 3 parts. In the first, we hear from Zarathustra that his soul is the song of a lover and a well that springs forth. As such, it expresses the love or craving for love that lies within Zarathustra's soul. The second part of the speech portrays Zarathustra's present situation, his pouring forth his teaching in an effort to affect the souls and minds of his disciples. He is light. They are the darkness that drinks in this light. Zarathustra, as light-giving, as offering love, longs for reciprocity in love. He longs to receive love. He ardently desires that his disciples might rise to the level of his bestowing virtue, his own solar dispensation, and its unstinting brightness, that they might reflect back to him his very self. Instead, he is surrounded by an all-consuming night. His light is eclipsed by his craving to desire, by his envy for his disciples' dark receptivity, and by his own relentless solitude. In their inequality and inferiority, he cannot know whether his love, that is his speech, touches their souls. Indeed, whether he has affected them in any way at all, let alone whether he has affected the liberation of their minds and will. The consequence? He is seized by a desire to affect their wills by injuring them, by withholding his light or wisdom or love, by letting them feel their inferiority, by putting them to shame. He succumbs to a desire to take revenge upon them, in and for their inferiority, as the putative cause of his solitude. My joy in giving died in giving. My virtue exhausted itself in its overflow. One might add that his love in its expression declined into hatred and spite. In the third and final part of his Night Song, Zarathustra imagines his having successfully transformed his disciples through his teaching into his true equals, into his fellow sons, his fellow creators. Now indeed, certain and beautiful, they stand reflecting one another in their equality as enemies. His solitude is reproduced and his craving for love intensified in the consummation of the relationship between himself and his former disciples, now his fellow creators. The enmity of light towards what gives light, unjust towards all other sons, thus travels every son. At the end of this unhappy reflection, Zarathustra declares, I long for speech. The speech he longs for cannot be of the character of the monologues he has thus far offered. What is the meaning of Zarathustra's self-reflection? Let us translate his speech from images to arguments. The first thing we learn from the Night Song, immediately confirmed by the songs that follow it, is that Zarathustra's endeavors have been motivated not only by his vain desire to verify his transhuman state, but by a longing for love, to love and be loved, a human longing for a human bond, whose lack, it turns out, he feels with great intensity. Something far from the self-sufficient grandeur of a superman. This self-reflection reveals that Zarathustra now knows the path he took in the wish to relieve his solitude was ill-conceived. He is suffering the effects of his attempt to transmit his wisdom as a true doctrine. Neither for those who offer nor for those who receive can the recitation of a catechism tell us anything of the condition of the soul reciting it. There can be no indication of the presence of real thought. Zarathustra offers, and his disciples accept his conclusions, without ever having articulated the questions these conclusions seek to answer or address. Dialogic speech, in which an ironical mode prevails, in which surface and depth may be distinguished, would appear to be the solution to this problem. But Zarathustra is not one to dissemble his wisdom. He cannot do so according to the terms of that wisdom itself. His failure to dissemble, however, has put him in the position of an ostensibly superhuman lover who punishes those human, all too human objects of his love for their failure to reciprocate that love according to the severe standards in giving and receiving that he adopts. Zarathustra has indeed been infected by the venom of the tarantula, by the tarantula of all tarantulas, the greatest of all tribunes and tyrants of the people, and the perfect preacher of equality. One can see that Zarathustra's desire to be the cause of the transformation of the minds and wills of his disciples has put him on the horns of a dilemma. Either his disciples accept the truth of his teaching with their mind and bind their will to this truth in their creating, or in rejecting this teaching so as to liberate their will in its creating, bind their mind to falsehood. Either they remain camel-like friends of Zarathustra, sharing equally in the truth that he proclaims, but remaining inferior to him in the limitation of their wills, or they become lion-like enemies, equal to Zarathustra in their freedom, but inferior to him in their mind's adoption of delusion. The freedom of the mind and the freedom of the will are not merely distinct, they are incompatible. As for the child, it is an impossible condition. It is a self-contradictory aspiration. Zarathustra's experiment has failed to confirm his will to power doctrine. The fact that this demonstration has been completed not in action, but in speech alone, reveals the priority of speech to deed when it comes to the demonstration of the truth, and therefore the independence of the realm of speech and thought. If mind and will are two, not one, the soul and the body are two as well. Soul is alive in the realm of speech. It is not a word for something about the body. Consequent upon the revelation of these truths, from the night song forward, the argument takes a remarkable turn. Zarathustra faces a fork in the road, and he takes it. Two arguments now run along parallel tracks. One involves a meditation on what it would require for the will to be free. The other investigates and uncovers the conditions that make possible the freedom of the mind. The argument concerning the will proves to be a reductio ad absurdum. It culminates in the insight that for the will to be free in the superlative metaphysical sense would necessitate that the will be a causa prima, and that this in its turn would require the will to assume the character of a causa sui, that it be self-caused. The concept of the causa sui is described by Nietzsche as mere nonsense, a kind of rape and violation of nature, having its origin in mankind's inordinate pride. This is the path followed by Zarathustra in his meditations on the past and the will's resentment against time, on what redemption from the past would necessarily entail, and on how this would lead inevitably to the thought of willing the past and the eternal recurrence of the same. From the point of view of the will's resentment and counterwill against time and times it was, necessity, accident, and chance are all monstrous obstacles to its liberation. The argument concerning the mind and its freedom displays the way to liberation from the bonds of lawful opinion and morality, and the intellect's love for and embrace of chance, accident, non-being or appearance, speech, necessity, and finally eternity. What for the will are constraints, for the mind are the fundamental presuppositions of its life and freedom. Amor fati, as Nietzsche conceives of it, is not the resigned submission of the will to fate, but the joyful recognition of the mind of those preconditions without which it could not exist. It is a form of self-love. Nietzsche, quite ingeniously, links these two arguments in their final unfolding in the ambiguous thought of the eternal return of the same. The argument concerning the conditions of the freedom of the mind begins with Zarathustra's rediscovery of the soul. At the opening of the dance song, Zarathustra is walking through a forest at twilight in search of a well or a fountain. As the little love drama of this song reveals, the search for the well begins when Zarathustra's conviction that he has discovered the ground or cause of the soul and mind in the will collapses. In his perplexity, he now considers life to be unfathomable. In the song, Zarathustra sings in mockery of the mind of heaviness and himself, however. A personified life, one of two women with whom Zarathustra is in love, laughingly denies that she may be said to possess a fundamental ground or cause. Nor, however, is she willing to be called unfathomable. It is morally virtuous men, she insists, who inevitably wish to attribute such qualities falsely to women like herself. She pulls Zarathustra back up from the depths of her open eyes with her golden fishing rod, an implement she shares with the other woman with whom Zarathustra is carrying on a triangular love affair, his lady Wisdom. Both life and wisdom advise Zarathustra to cease attempting to plumb the depths. If he is prudent, he will remain on the surface. This is where any discoveries concerning life and wisdom are to be made. In other words, Zarathustra is encouraged by his beloved women to cease to attempt to understand the matter in question by offering causal accounts. He must rather stay true to the appearances of things. They attempt to persuade him, unsuccessfully as yet, to ask not why, but what is. Zarathustra is not yet ready to follow their good counsel. He remains a clumsy and inept lover. He remains, for the moment, a dogmatist. Yet the song itself suggests that he has made some progress. He finally adopts a questioning attitude, comes to understand that he is in the presence of the unknown, and is finally able to mock and laugh at himself. However that may be, a return to the surface when it comes to the question of the soul would entail the rediscovery of the ancient conception, according to which soul is both a source of life and a source of knowledge. As we have seen, the distinction between life and knowledge has followed upon Zarathustra's discovery that law, as a condition of collective life, of the herd, as he calls it, cannot be made to coincide with knowledge and self-knowledge that is desired by the mind of the individual human being. In the wake, that is, of his recognition of the impossibility of rational law. Zarathustra's lady loves remain elusive. Though certainly distinct, they are enigmatically akin, and their resemblance is enough to cause Zarathustra to confuse the one for the other, and so to fail to conceive properly the relationship between them. The mirroring of life and wisdom is strangely reflected in the mirroring of the imagery Nietzsche employs in narrating the incidents of the dance song and the imagery Zarathustra employs in his song itself. Nietzsche portrays Zarathustra as walking with his disciples through a dark forest, searching for a well. There he comes upon a group of beautiful girls dancing. Though they cease their dance at Zarathustra's approach, he encourages them to continue, reassuring them that he is no spoiler of play, that he casts no evil glances upon their games and pleasures. On the contrary, he declares that he is God's advocate before the devil. His devil is the mind of heaviness, mind dominated by the moral law. And being, as he is, an enemy of this devil, he could hardly be an enemy of lovely girls and beautiful dances. It is true, he admits, he is a forest and night of dark trees. But amid the darkness, one will find rose slopes, and amid the roses, the little god whom girls love best, Cupido, the god of love. Even now, he lies beside the well, eyes closed, having fallen asleep in broad daylight, tired perhaps from chasing butterflies. In Nietzsche's setting, Zarathustra seeks a well in a dark forest and finds beautiful girls dancing in a clearing. In Zarathustra's self-portrait, he paints his soul in similar colors, a dark forest with clearings in which a well is to be found. And beside the well asleep, the god whose advocate he is, the god of erotic love. Suddenly, however, after Zarathustra has taken this opportunity to chastise him, this god leaps from out of Zarathustra's soul and into the forest where the girls are found to begin to dance with the girls to the tune of Zarathustra's song. How can Cupido, a metaphor for Zarathustra's own insufficiently wakeful eros, suddenly leap out of Zarathustra's soul into the very forest in which Zarathustra and the girls have met, and whose appearance Zarathustra used as a metaphor to describe his soul? This is an extraordinarily Baroque poetical conceit. Within it, however, Nietzsche embeds an argument. Zarathustra has yet to reflect sufficiently on the implications of his recent discoveries when it comes to the manner of his speech. If soul cannot be reduced to body, then neither can mind to the imagination. Zarathustra's florid imagistic rhetoric seemed to be the consequence of his opinion that mind and soul may be reduced to will and body. Now that he has discovered the falsehood of this opinion, his speech ought to transform in accordance with the transformation of his understanding. In his dance song, however, he continues to employ the same sorts of conceits that dominated the presentation of his teaching to his disciples. And yet his song is sung in a spirit of self-mockery and has embedded within it a kind of dialogue. Moreover, through the imagery of Zarathustra's song, Nietzsche shows us the underpinnings of Zarathustra's causal account of man, and by these means, the general principles of all causal accounts. Just as Zarathustra personifies and divinizes his own eros, and then punishes him as the cause of Zarathustra's own insufficient wakefulness in regard to the significance and character of love, so Nietzsche implies Zarathustra reified his own will, elevated it under the name of will to power, personified it in the figure of the overman, to the status of the first cause of all things human. It is this will, Nietzsche suggests, that lies behind making literal the metaphorical. It is this will that lies behind the desire to punish and take revenge. It is this will as the mind of heaviness that was behind Zarathustra's causal, that is mythological, account of body, soul, and mind, as all having their root in the will to power. The mind of heaviness, Zarathustra will discover, is at its most intense the mind of revenge. It is the mind of revenge that has animated the moral teachings of Zarathustra. Thank you.